We are back on the 0 Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and what is this Russia story all about? I would argue we don't know enough to know enough about what that story is all about, but our next guest is going to help us decode what we do and don't know. Marcy Wheeler is an independent journalist who specializes in national security and civil liberties. She got very well known by live blocking the Scooter Libby trial. Those many years ago, she has written at The Guardian, Salon, The Progressive, other outlets. You see her on TV a lot talking about this stuff, and she is the author of Anatomy of Deceit, which was a primer on the CIA leak investigation. So, Marcy, thanks for coming back on the show.
Hey, good to be here.
So, you've written some of the most sensible stuff yet I've seen. Your blog is emptywheel.net. I guess I start out with this. I know I'm an old lefty, but I'm never by what an anonymous CIA official tells me. I never take it at face value, much less decide that, as I've seen MSNBC personalities do, that Jill Stein is a Putinite, as I heard one say. I just believe in skepticism informing something like this and a desire to see the evidence. Am I being unreasonable?
No, I think we can believe that Putin intervened to help Trump, but also be alarmed. We can even believe all the leaks we've heard so far, but also be alarmed by the way in which these CIA leaks have come out since Friday.
Yeah, I mean, here's my understanding of the sequence that, and I've mentioned this to people and I've got way more questions than answers, but President Obama said last week he wanted a 17-agency review of what happened exactly with the Russians in the election. This is my understanding, before he leaves office on January 20th. And preemptively, on Friday, this story came out about the CIA reaching the conclusion, and it seemed to later turn out it was an interpretation of facts, that this not only did happen, but was done to make Trump the president. Have I basically got the facts right?
Right, and that makes it just like the Iraq War. I mean, it might be well-intentioned, but the same thing happened in August, September 2002. Dick Durbin asked President Bush for a national intelligence estimate to make the case behind the Iraq War. And just as that process started, there were all these leaks to the New York Times about aluminum tubes. And by the time Congress actually got the NIE a month later, guess what? They were already convinced and didn't see a bunch of the dissents that were in the document that is supposed to show what kind of real dissents there still are. So yeah, it's the same dynamic. It might be that the CIA people have our best interests in mind. It might be that they have some mixed interests, and we can talk about that. But the process itself should raise alarms in people who care about civilian control of our intelligence industry.
Yeah, I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I get flack from even friends when I say, I'd really like to see the evidence. I'm not comfortable with the process. And I just worry that because it buttresses a certain political point of view, people are kind of hastening or hurrying through, the right way to uncover stories like this. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Well, not only that, but, Trump is out there today saying, well, if this was such a problem, why didn't Obama raise it during the election? There's a really good explanation for that, which is that when they went to Congress and said they wanted to raise it, Mitch McConnell objected and said that he would make a political stink out of it. But even after the election, and this is not widely known, over Thanksgiving weekend, the White House released a statement, anonymous statement to the New York Times, basically saying, we believe that the election outcome reflects the will of the voters. Well, that's a pretty remarkable statement if in September, the CIA had already decided that Putin had intervened to help Trump. Now, I think there are some of the stories which support the case that Friday's Washington Post story, which said our conclusion is now that the motivation for Putin was to help Trump, not just, cause chaos. I think the real motivation started off as something entirely different, which we should come back to. And then even crazier, today's new NBC story, which says we know that Putin was personally involved, that was attributed to brand new intelligence from foreign governments. Again, we saw some. I was joking around with somebody else who covered the Iraq War intelligence very closely, and I'm like, the 16 words. The British government has learned that Vladimir Putin has found lots of votes for Donald Trump. That's more than 16, but I quoted it on Twitter.
Right.
I mean, it's the same process, and it is designed to create a lot of alarm. If that alarm was there, if that alarm was as fully formed as CIA now sounds to be, really, this should have come out as soon as they felt that alarm, and not waited believing that Hillary would win. Because even if Hillary won, you still have this aftermath, and you still have, I'd much rather President Obama deal with Putin in the act, in the process, than have Hillary, who was an incredible hawk, ran as a hawk, ran with all the neocons, come in and have that casus belli to go to war against Russia. So in either case, it was a bad option. If it was this bad, if the evidence to support this argument existed back in August, we should have been told about it in August.
Well, I couldn't agree more. For one thing, based on the principle of transparency, for another, for all the reasons you just listed. But Marcy Wheeler, I also feel that, you touched on something that I think is very important, which is, and again, this is granted, I'm paranoid, granted, but I've also seen intelligence agencies do things that aren't that good. Okay, but virtually the entire national security establishment came out strongly for Hillary Clinton in the election. And I just wonder, the sort of flip side of your question is, what's the motivation for talking about this now and not then? Now you say, well, one reason might be everybody thought she would win, but what is the motivation for talking about it now and not then?
The other thing to be skeptical about, first of all, the most obvious explanation, and it's not just me, it's also people I completely disagree, Russian hawks I completely disagree with, like Mike McFaul, former ambassador, Michael Hayden, former CIA NSA director, and they both have said that the most logical explanation is that Vladimir Putin retaliated in response for actions he believed to have targeted him and his interests, starting with when Hillary's State Department negotiated the Libya arrangement. They told Russia very specifically that the goal was to protect civilians, not regime change. Hillary has since basically said, no, it was regime change all along. So one reason for Putin to be angry. In December of 2011, big protests in Russia. Putin very explicitly blamed Hillary Clinton for those. I don't know whether he has any evidence to support that claim, but he believes that Hillary caused those protests, undermining his claim to be fairly elected. In 2012, we start intervening covertly in Syria. In 2014, and that's acknowledged. It's very clear that the CIA has been involved in Syria, which he considers a prime Russian interest, a client state. And then finally, Ukraine, after Hillary left, he believes was a coup. So I'm not saying I agree that Putin is right on all those things. I'm saying that we know that Putin believes all of those things were the U.S. covertly tampering with Russian interests. And so the most logical explanation for why they did this is target Hillary Clinton, who was involved in 3 of them. But if that's the explanation, if you had to go to the American people and say, golly, our election just got hijacked because in retaliation for 4 covert operations, or 2 alleged and 2 confirmed covert operations we led, we might start asking a lot more questions about the trade-offs to CIA's covert operations.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me a little bit of the conversation. That is a great questions. It reminds me a lot of the conversations we used to have around 9/11, where people would say, somebody might say this could be blowback for our activities in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And then it was, oh, you're justifying it. It's not about justifying. It's about looking for motivations to protect us in the future. But even if that's the case, why, again, I don't get why bring it up now. If I were a senior CIA official, I'd just say, okay, let's just change the subject from what we did in Syria.
Well, and then the other but see, so they're not telling that story, which I find suspicious in and of itself. I mean, the NBC story today is the first one that even mentioned it. That should lead every story because that is the most logical explanation, and you could argue that it's natural that you'd come to hate Hillary more, or that you'd come to learn that Trump would support your interests more. But any story that doesn't include that, you should distrust. The timing, the other interesting thing about timing here, two things. One is, that Obama called for that review. And by coming forward, CIA preempted the views of FBI, which we've heard say that they're not convinced. James Clapper is not convinced. So CIA has us all believing this already, whereas we know that some people in the intelligence community aren't so convinced. The other thing is, CIA, Donald Trump is not taking the intelligence community's briefings. Has happened before.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon was worse. But, in this transition period, intelligence community always kind of co-opts the president. They tell him scary stories and they co-opt them. And I'm not saying that's bad. I suspect that Trump's advisors, including Mike Flynn, who was part of that process, know that once you get into these briefings, the president becomes kind of joined at the hip with the intelligence community, and they've delayed it or limited it. But it is not beyond the realm of possibility that one of the reasons CIA came forward with this now is because they're not having that opportunity to join themselves to the hip of Donald Trump.
So interesting, very interesting. Now let's just, if you would, Marcy Wheeler, what I'm trying to figure out is, what exactly do we think we know about this? A lot of people say, well, Russia hacked the election. Well, I think what we know, I don't think there's any evidence for hacking voting machines. I think what we have is some evidence that suggests that people of Russian origin, and maybe compelling evidence, that people from Russia hacked the DNC and helped WikiLeaks, gave them to WikiLeaks to release. And there's reason to logically assume they might be associated with the Russian government. That's what we're talking about here, isn't it? Am I wrong?
Really quickly, most technical experts agree that the people who hacked the DNC and Podesta used a set of tools that is associated with Russian military intelligence.
Okay.
So it's possible somebody stole those tools and went to great lengths to frame the Russians, but the tools involved are tools that are commonly, it's Vladimir Putin's hammer. It was left at the scene of the crime. That's what we know about it. We also know, obviously, that WikiLeaks released the documents. What had been missing before Friday's story from CIA was any sense that the intelligence community knew how the documents got from Russian military intelligence to WikiLeaks, and they're now claiming that they know the people involved who have ties to the Russian government. So that's the short version of the story. I agree that the evidence that Russia hacked any voting machines or any voter registration, very thin. And in fact, the intelligence community has repeatedly stopped short of saying there's, in that case, it is Russians, right? And then there's the fake news. But the key story is, I think there is a strong case to say that the tools used to hack the DNC and John Podesta are tools that it's Vladimir Putin's hammer. I mean, that's the short version.
Okay. Yeah, I trust you. So if you say it is, it is. That's one of the reasons why I asked. I guess last sort of broad question, crazy hypothetical, but if you were Barack Obama, would you be angry at your Central Intelligence Agency right now about this Friday story?
Yeah, and I suspect James Clapper, who nominally leads the intelligence community, is too, because, he got called in to do a briefing for the House Intelligence Committee and ended up blowing them off, which I have problems with, except that I also think that, remember that Devin Nunes is a transition official for Trump, as is Richard Burr. So the two committee chairmen who should have been investigating this in August, right? Mm-hmm. Both transition officials for Trump. And so can you trust them with the intelligence, with the most sensitive intelligence, if Trump is going to, that's the place we've gotten to. So yeah, if I were Obama, I'd be really angry. But at the same time, I think a lot of Democrats are protecting Obama because he is the single person in all of government who could have released this at any time after the intelligence community became familiar with it. Even now, he could release it. And so, I think the secrecy of the administration does foster these kinds of intelligence leaks. And I think that breeds cynicism on all sides.
Last question, Marcy. Has this gotten crazier than when you first got into national security reporting you ever thought it would get?
Yeah, the first time's a tragedy, the second time's a farce, right?
Yeah.
It's the same stuff.
Yeah.
I think what Trump is going to do is use the tools that we never shut down after George Bush used them. And frankly, Obama expanded a lot of them. And he is going to use them with a lot more cynicism, a lot more graft, a lot more corruption, and frankly, a lot more racism and bigotry. So that's where we're headed. The relationship between the intelligence community and Trump, what's different here is he's trying to buck the long-term establishment, and whereas Dick Cheney tried to kind of end run it, to stovepipe it, Trump is basically trying to he'll try and remake it in his own image,
which is terrifying, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we'll have to leave it there. But Marcy Wheeler, a journalist in national securities and civil liberties, always great to talk to you, even when the news is so grim.
Sorry to be so depressing.
Yeah, so thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.